Morning, everybody. Good morning, everybody. I hope you are well this Friday, the 31st of March, 2023. My name is Retabile Mbokodi. I'm the program manager here at the Global Compact Network South Africa. We can't wait and we are looking forward to hosting you this morning. I'm sure you're excited about today's Compact. It's going to be exciting. I can't wait to hear it all. As you have seen, our title for the Compact Dialogue today on human rights is 26 years on business reflection on the Bill of Rights. We have our esteemed guests who are going to be talking to us to this topic, reflecting on the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, saying what has gone on, what is the status quo, what is business doing, what are those challenges, what more can business do, really, what is that best practice? So without any further ado, I'm going to hand over to my executive director, who's going to take on from now on. And please enjoy the session. Thank you. Over to you, Dr. A.
Thank you, Retabile, for that introduction. Welcome, all of you who have joined us this morning. We really appreciate that you've taken the time at 11 to just come and have this conversation. And we are calling it a reflection 26 years on. In a moment, I will introduce the panel. But before that, I always would like to talk a bit about the Global Compact. And the reason why I'm going to do that is because this platform called the Compact Dialogues on Human Rights, sometimes you call it the Compact Dialogues on the SDGs, depending on the issue that we have on the table. It is the platform that is open to everybody, to civil society, to those companies participating in the Global Compact, to broadly even companies who are not participating with us, to young people, to community-based organizations. This is our overarching platform where we drive these critical conversations bordering on the role of business, on responsible business. So today we have people in the room who may not be Global Compact participants. And so I would take a moment to just really reflect on that. But before I go there, this is what our agenda looks like. We have a panel of 3, and we will be reflecting on our collective performance on the Constitution and specifically on the Bill of Rights to date. I'll come back to that in a moment. But who are we as the UN Global Compact? The brainchild of the late Kofi Annan when he was Secretary General of the UN, calling on business endeavors in February to come together with others to initiate a global compact of shared values and principles. And with that speech, the Global Compact was formed a year later with 44 CEOs who had turned up at the invitation of the late Kofi Annan. And so we have always, in 22 years of our lifetime, driven this advocacy benchmarked on the 10 principles on human rights, on labor rights or labor protection, on environmental protection and stewardship, and on anti-corruption. When we look at the 10 principles, our view is that business needs to unpack them and understand their role on the 10 principles. And human rights is number 1 deliberately, because it's foundational to everything else. And then in 2015 come the SDGs, and we now advocate a principle-based approach to the SDGs. So the 10 principles are still pretty core to business performance, to business responsibilities, and they are really inward looking into the business conduct. How do we behave as a business and what it is? What are those principles that should guide the way we do business? The SDGs give business a framework to contribute to societal priorities, to developmental priorities. But the 10 principles, if you like, is the ESG framework that is more inward looking onto business behavior. So we do advocate a principle-based approach to the global goals. And we enable companies to use these principles and the SDGs in very specific ways to drive impact on specific goals. And one of those goals where we are asking companies to drive impact is on human rights and several others. And we've picked out these goals because we believe it's where business would have an outsized effect on outcomes. And so if we center human rights, employ a human rights lens, then we will highly likely get everything else right. The second way that we enable business to do this is for them to scale ambitious action. We work with companies of all sizes in different geographies and sectors and across value chains and through entire ecosystems. So our footprint as the Global Compact is massive. And we believe with that leverage, business can drive ambition on the key priority areas. And then, of course, transparency is important for us. So we give business a framework to communicate publicly. And this enables them to make measurable progress on the activities that they embark on responsible business. And so if you are in the room and you're a company or an organization that is interested in our movement, please, you can always reach out to us. But today is about reflecting on the Constitution. And I wanted to put the categories of rights on the screen, just to remind us as we go into the panel. I think we'll come to elements of this back and forth. And even as business tackles their own responsibility on human rights, this is really the foundational document that they would be looking at. And so with that, I will stop sharing and I will go on to introduce our panel. And we have a really, really good panel of very experienced human rights advocates, both in business, in academia, and in the human rights terrain. And our first panelist, and I'll introduce them according to the way they will speak. And I'll call on Advocate Seliso Tipanyane first. I'm just gonna read a bit, so just give me a few moments to read a bit of the bio. So Advocate is the chairperson of the South African Institute for Responsible and Accountable Governance, and is the former chief executive officer of the South African Human Rights Commission and former CEO of the Safer South Africa Foundation. He spent over 13 years at the Human Rights Commission, initially as head of research, then responsible for the monitoring of economic and social rights and access to information rights before becoming the CEO. So that alone already, I think, is really great for us. And I will be asking the advocate to give us a bit of context. Our second speaker will be Rabbi Gideon Pogrund. And Gideon is the founding director of the Center for Business Ethics at GIBS. And at the center, it connects business with academia and society, locally and internationally, to co-create ethical solutions for business challenges. He has led a series of research-based projects which address ethical challenges, including corruption, whistleblowing, accounting sector ethics, SMME ethics, gender-based violence, and the COVID vaccine rollout. I will ask my team to just drop these bios onto the chat so we can read the entire extent of them. There's a lot of information, but very, very relevant to what we'll be talking about today. And our final panelist will be Linda Kuzwayo. Linda is from Anglo Platinum. Linda Kuzwayo is an admitted attorney, having practiced at Bowmans, one of South Africa's top 5 law firms with a vast African footprint. Prior to obtaining her Bachelor of Laws degree from WITS, she obtained a Bachelor of Arts degree from the University of Cape Town with a double major in media and business French. She subsequently completed her LLM, Master of Laws in International and European Business Law at the University of Lyon in France. Her role at Anglo Platinum allows her to solidify the implementation of positive impact of justice, advocacy, and the law on communities in mining areas. Linda is responsible for business and human rights, strategic ESG projects, and engaging with civil society on various issues. So welcome our panelists, and I will quickly go to Advocate Seliso. And the background really is that 26 years since South Africa's democratic constitution, how far have we come? How has business responded, especially on the Bill of Rights? And if you remember, the month of March is South Africa's Human Rights Month, with the 21st of March having been Human Rights Day. For us at the Global Compact, we work on these issues daily, but we use these important dates to heighten dialogue and engagement, to heighten advocacy on human rights, and just to keep reminding business that a lot of work still needs to be done, and it must be done. But over to Advocate Seliso Tipanyane. Please take the platform and give us your reflections on the interface between business and constitutionalism in the country, past, present, and towards the future. Welcome, Advocate.
Thank you, colleagues, for the opportunity. I want to start by citing a quote here of Nelson Mandela, which he made in 1997, where he says, "Poverty and material inequality are enemies of lasting peace and stability." And therefore, when we talk about business and constitutionalism in South Africa, we're really talking about how best have we done as a country to give effect to the values and principles which inform our constitutional democracy and our constitution. And some of these values, of course, will include human dignity, non-racialism, will include accountability, and responsive and accountable governance. Now, in the context of where we are today, clearly we have lots of problems as far as giving effect to the values of our constitution. We have high levels of poverty, unemployment, high levels of corruption and crime and violence. We have an economy which is falling apart to some extent. So it's very clear then that as far as constitutionalism is concerned, we have not done very well in that regard. And of course, we also have to give ourselves a pat on the back in the sense that, it's 29 years so far. Next it will be 30. So we have come a long way as a country, and therefore there are many good things which we have done. But we also have to acknowledge some of the challenges which I've already referred to. Now, then the question then is, what then is the role of business in this regard? Now, as a constitutional lawyer, one is quite clear that countries do not succeed without a meaningful role of business in advancing the country's values, in strengthening its constitutional democracy. So in our country, I want to say that there has been a mixed role played by business as enforcers as well as underminers. And of course, this also links to the historical role which business has played in our country under colonialization and apartheid, and that we cannot ignore. But there are also positive roles which business has played. Now, our constitutional framework also makes provisions for the role of business in strengthening our constitutional democracy. So if we look at Section 8 of our Constitution, the Bill of Rights also binds juristic bodies, companies, so to speak. But then you also look at the Companies Act. The Companies Act also provides that the company law in our country must be implemented, taking into account the Bill of Rights. You also see in Companies Act the establishment of bodies of structures in companies like the social and ethics committees, which could also help to play a role. And we have seen, of course, in the terms of funding of elections, companies have been funding elections and political parties. even though, of course, there's a need for greater regulation in there, because that also leads to corruption, hence the need to regulate this. But now, when you look at the levels of poverty and inequality in our country, clearly there is a problem in terms of what companies should be doing. And this is where one is saying that there's been a mixed role in this regard. Because, let's take, for example, some of the issues you mentioned under the Global Compact environment. Companies are making lots of money in our country. At the same time, they've also been at the forefront in polluting our environment. So there is therefore a need really to find a meaningful balance between the role of companies to make profit, as well as our responsibility as a responsible citizen in our country. Hence, there's provisions in our constitution to say companies are also bound by the Bill of Rights. Now, at that global level, there have been very interesting developments with the adoption of the UN guiding principles for business and human rights, which basically, requires companies to be as far as our role in advancing human rights are concerned. And of course, we are also aware that there are attempts at international level to have a binding treaty for business and human rights, so that at least business can also be held to account in a much stronger manner than we're seeing now as far as human rights are concerned. However, there has been some criticism also around the role of businesses as far as human rights are concerned, because the UN standards at this point in time tend to talk more about companies respecting human rights, and therefore that also means companies must just do what is possible to avoid violating human rights. But the advancement of human rights is not just based on respect. There are moves that companies must also play a greater role in advancing human rights. And of course, there are some of them, as we are saying, in terms of supporting funding political parties, in terms of our social responsibilities. But on the whole, one would want to argue that in our country, due to the historic nature of business, business has not really been at the forefront in advancing our country. If you look at other developed countries, US and UK, you see the role of business. And I think one of the reasons is because, to a large extent, our big businesses have been focusing more on extraction. You come here to our country, make money and take it away, and not really invest in building a viable country where you stay here. So we need to address that and change the mindset of business, especially the multinational ones, but also the small ones. Now, on other issues which I also want to highlight as a concern for me, the issue of corruption is quite high in our country. And yet one has not seen business, playing a bigger role in fighting corruption, which is also linked to the value of accountability, which is part of our constitutional values. So one really would like to see business playing a much bigger role in supporting whistleblowers in order to continue the fight against corruption, which then helps us to strengthen our democracy and strengthen human rights. And then also, the regulation of corporate funding. Companies could also play a bigger role in funding political parties in order to strengthen multi-party democracy. But, the funding from companies is, it's not very clear, it's not very consistent, and that's why then there has been this law. But in terms of the Companies Act itself, there is no adequate regulation of how companies fund political parties and how transparent and how accountable boards are in this regard. So that's one area which one would definitely would want to look at as a way of ensuring that companies play a greater role as far as human rights are concerned. But really, for me, I think it really requires a mind shift in the minds of companies, that your role is not just to make money in our country. Your role is to contribute in nation building, and you have to invest, because after all, you are benefiting from the resources of this of our country, whether it's mining or whatever, and therefore you have to give back. But due to the nature due to the legacy of the past, a lot of businesses are funded from outside, and therefore the focus just to say, how much money can we make in our country, in South Africa, without causing too much problems, and then we leave and we take our monies back. And that has been one of the challenges. That's why at this point in time, we have these high levels of inequality in our country between the rich and the poor. And hence what Mandela said earlier on, that poverty and material inequality are enemies of lasting peace and stability. So how do you run your business in an environment which is actually undermining your long-term interests? And how come you're not investing adequately to ensure that, we address the issues of poverty and inequality in our country? And then we can say, well, businesses are indeed a useful member of society and a major player in building our country and our democracy, and therefore an advancing constitutionalism in our country. Thanks. Let me stop here.
Thank you very much, Advocate, for your insights. You've given us quite a lot, and we'll be coming back to them. I think what I'm hearing, if I could pull it all together, is you've just called for business to be more stronger, active citizens in the country. And I like that you brought in the link to corruption, human rights, and the link to corruption. And the reason why I'm bringing this is then you also linked your conversation to the support for whistleblowers. And on that note, I will go to Gideon, because I know that he wants to talk about whistleblowing more specifically, and that role of business and how business and also the link to constitutional. So to take it forward, and we'll come back to this if there's time, and unpack some of these key highlights that are already coming through. Over to you, Gideon. Thank you, Advocate.
Thank you very much, Achieng. And I would be happy to talk about whistleblowing later. As you mentioned in the introduction, that's been a key focus area of our center. But perhaps I can begin speaking in broader terms and in regard to the Constitution, about which I'm no expert, unlike Advocate Tseliso. But I saw an interview with Justice Edwin Cameron, and he was asked about what he thought the central value in the Constitution was. And he said it was this vision of dignity. And the myriad problems which Tseliso described are clearly incompatible with dignity. Now, to fulfill the Constitution's vision of dignity, I want to suggest that we have to address the past. And the reason why we have to address the past, because the past profoundly shapes the present and the future. Previous injustices continue to be responsible for current ones. The German author Günter Grass spoke about the clogged up toilet of the past, which ruins the present, which means to say that if we don't address that clogged up toilet of the past, however uncomfortable or unpleasant it may be, it's going to mess up our present and indeed our future. And so these previous injustices in South Africa, these historic injustices, continue to create current injustices. Now, this need to address the past is explicitly mentioned in the preamble of the Constitution, which speaks about, to quote, the need to recognize the injustices of our past, and which speaks about the need to heal the divisions of the past and establish a society based on democratic values, social justice, and fundamental human rights. But the second part of that statement, the establishment of this society, is based on addressing the past. So I think that is something which is critically important. It's also reflected in the court, which of course implements the Constitution and which is built with bricks from the prison. So that in that symbolic reality, you have that incorporation of past and present. You can only, and future, you can only enable a different present and future if you address the past. And if you spend time at Constitutional Hill, you see this, I think, extraordinary relationship between the past and the future. Because on the one hand, you go and look at the jail and you see this very brutal and dark past being documented. That's our history, which we can't run away from. We have to face it. But on the other hand, as well as the court, you see this extraordinary work that's been done. You see, for example, Flame Studio, the state-of-the-art recording studio, which people come to record music inspired by the values of the Constitution. Or you go to the Truth to Power Lounge, where people have all sorts of engagements, including corporate engagements, and which are about enabling a different kind of future. So I think that this is the kind of approach that is critical. And it's one which has profound implications for business. So I certainly agree with, as you said, Achieng, business has to become a stronger, active citizen. And this was very much, I think, a summary of what the advocate said. There's got to be this kind of shifting of mindset. But I would like to suggest something a little bit different, and which is in line with what I've said so far. So if you look at the last couple of decades, there's been a transformation in our understanding of the purpose and role of the corporation. The classic view, at least in the West, about the corporation was most famously summarized by Milton Friedman: the business of business is business. What's called shareholder primacy or shareholder capitalism. I think we've moved away from that. If not always in action, then certainly in rhetoric. But there certainly is a recognition that business's role needs to be more stakeholder orientated, and indeed in line with what both of you have said. But what I want to suggest is that in that more stakeholder orientated approach, the focus tends to be on the future instead of on the past, what you might call responsibility to instead of responsibility for. And what I want to suggest is that because past wrongs continue to shape the present, perpetuating problems of human misery, companies also need to take responsibility for the past. And this is not to say that we have to live in the past, but that we have to live with the past. And this is something which has a normative basis. It's something which is important for ethical reasons, but it's also important for instrumental reasons or for pragmatic reasons, because organizations licensed to operate, particularly in sectors like the mining sector, to a significant extent depend on this engagement with the past. And so engaging with the past has important implications in terms of corporate legitimacy, trust, reputation, and improved stakeholder relationships. So companies have to, I would suggest, address the past in order to enable a different kind of future. And let me just conclude by saying this. As we all know, there is a widespread gloom and frustration in the country. And it exists especially with young people. Young people who languish in poverty, who don't have jobs, and even worse, don't have any hope of getting a job. It's like the psychiatrist Viktor Frankl said, it's a state of futurelessness, where people don't have a sense of a future, where people are bereft of hope. And that's something which is tragic and very dangerous. addressing the past to enable a different kind of future is about giving people hope. And I would suggest to you that business plays a critical role in this. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Gideon, for your inputs. And you're talking about the shift, and I think it is that shift that is important. The shift that the business of business is no longer just business. There are certain important considerations that business must indeed take. And then on to your second point about engaging with the past. Honestly, and I would add honestly engaging with the past and how we deal with that, especially for some sectors to be able to move forward. I will park those for now and we'll come back to unpack that a little later. But now I want to give Lindo her 10 minutes to just give us practically. And Lindo is from a company and in the mining sector, and Gideon just mentioned the mining sector. Lindo, what is going on? How far have we come in 26 years from Anglo Platinum's perspective or from Anglo America's perspective?
Thank you. Thanks, Dr. Achieng. And the short answer is I wish that I could holistically say, as you know, the corporate sector, that we've moved away from Milton Friedmanism, as Rabbi has explained. But the truth is that many companies actually still focus solely on compliance with legal requirements and regulations, which unfortunately are often inadequate to protect human rights. So what we've noticed is that, and I think we're all on the same page, is that a value-based approach to business, where respect for human rights is integrated into the company's core values and culture, is essential if we want to actually create a world where businesses operate in a more socially introspective and more of a responsible and socially responsible manner. And that's really the truth of the matter. So typically in a company, especially in the extractive industry, and a mining company like Anglo, you get standard environmental and social impact assessments, or ESIAs, you get EIAs, all of those processes that are done. But despite the ongoing debate and the different methodologies that are being developed in the area of human rights processes, there's still a lack of clear guidance that's focused on the mining sector itself, on how it is that we go about embedding human rights due diligence processes and the like. So among the topics that remain unclear, especially within the realm of specifically human rights due diligence processes, that are really quite critical to uncover from a baseline perspective what the realities are. Among those topics that remain unclear are, first of all, how do we build on existing risk management processes? So corporates tend to rely on these extensive risk management processes, but how do we build on that to reflect the human rights lens? Even considering, of course, that these risk management processes might be, they might cover much of the ground in terms of risk management specifically. The second thing is what tools are most useful to apply in different circumstances to essentially practicalize the statements, the fleeting statements that companies make about their commitment to human rights. The truth is that there's no one size fits all approach to the embedding of human rights, but it's understood that companies need to actually ensure that the approach adequately responds to the local context in which they operate. So typically, even a company like Anglo American Platinum, we have different mine sites. Even those different sites have different contextual realities, and that needs to be borne into mind. And in addition to that, considering that policy is often the best way to operationalize culture, it then becomes important to ensure that organizations constantly reassess their policies to reflect the necessary imperatives that they're trying to achieve. So for Anglo American Platinum specifically, which I can speak about, is that in addition to the industry bodies whose principles we align with, such as, of course, the UN Global Compact, such as the Minerals Council of South Africa, the International Council of Metals and Minerals, or the ICMM, the International Platinum Group Metal Association, also known as the IPA, This SDGs and commitments towards that, we also have an internal mechanism that sets what we call a way of working with our stakeholders, and that's called the Anglo-American Social Way, which many of you may have heard of. But the social way is modeled on, a bevy of international standards and local ones. So the IFC standards, the UNGPs, the voluntary principles on security and human rights, the ICMM's position statement and good practice guide on indigenous peoples and mining, the Initiative for Responsible Mining Assurance, which we all know as IRMA, as well as the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises. And then from a policy perspective, we also rely on our code of conduct, our human rights policy, as well as the responsible sourcing standard that we implement internally. And of course, within our supply chains as well. I'll speak about the Anglo-Social Way, and that's the tool, as I've said, through which we've been able to ensure that policies and systems are in place in all Anglo-American managed sites in order to support effective engagement with our host communities, in order to avoid or minimize adverse social impacts, and then also to maximize development opportunities. Please give me 1 minute. Just want to make sure I don't run out of power.
Okay. Just bear with us, participants. Linda will be back in a moment.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Brenda.
There you are.
So as I was saying, the Anglo-Social Way helps us to avoid or minimize social impacts, and we operationalize it internally to basically make our statements more practical. And in terms of the specific human rights requirements in it, we speak on training on human rights for employees, but we extend that obviously to contractors and business partners along the value chain, most importantly. We then also ensure integration into our risk and impact assessment processes. We ensure the integration of assessment results of the social way into our social management plans, into our operating model, and into our life of mine planning. So sort of bridging the gap between human rights and the more technical processes in the mining process. We also do an implementation of site level grievance mechanisms that are aligned with the social way itself. We also ensure continuous monitoring, evaluation, and then reporting on human rights. And then lastly, we ensure an involvement of potentially affected and affected stakeholders, including, obviously, importantly, within a human rights context, vulnerable groups in the assessment, the design, and the monitoring of mitigation measures. So there's almost the co-creation element that we make sure we build in. Then the second process is the SHIRA. It's almost the tool within a tool, if you like, within the social way. And basically that's the social and human rights impact and risk analysis. Some critical things to note about the SHIRA is that it provides a comprehensive cross-functional, if you like, assessment of social and human rights impacts annually. And that includes a prioritization rating that we use that reflects the UNGP process. There's a large focus, importantly, for a change on impacts as opposed to only business risks, which in the corporate context, we tend to focus on the business risks and not the actual impacts of processes and implementation. So the SHIRA is based on an extensive vulnerability assessment. And in that we look at both systemic as well as site-related vulnerability. External reporting is important and an imperative in the SHIRA. So we do this through community engagement forums or other types of forums like accountability forums. And it's therefore informed quite largely by stakeholder engagement. We then also use a mitigation hierarchy where we assess, seek to avoid, minimize, mitigate, and remediate potential negative impacts that may arise from site activities. The third tool I'll speak about is human rights due diligence processes. And that's in addition to that way of working that I've described. And these are specific from time to time where the need arises for us to conduct human rights due diligence processes. So we usually conduct periodically group-wide due diligence processes from the Anglo group function. And that therefore also includes our 3 business units and their various mine sites. But then at Anglo American Platinum specifically, we've recently conducted a human rights due diligence in 2022 at our Unki mine, which is situated in Zimbabwe. So the human rights due diligence intentionally integrates the UNGP's reporting requirements as well as the IRMA requirements on human rights due diligence. And finally, it also reflects the Anglo-American Social Way Policy and Toolkit, which, as I've stated, aims to embed human rights issues across the operations activities. And it's quite important that the 2 processes speak to each other. The last process I'll speak about is certification process like IRMA itself, which again is the Initiative for Responsible Mining Assurance. And what IRMA seeks to achieve is this utopia of a world in which the mining industry respects human rights and the aspirations of affected communities. It provides safe and healthy and supportive workplaces where the mining industry minimizes harm to the environment and actually leaves positive legacies. So Anglo American Platinum has 7 sites in South Africa and Zimbabwe that have undergone the IRMA audit process, and we're just on this journey of implementing as well. So notably, going through the process has actually called on us to improve processes where necessary, but it's also been helpful to have that independent lens looking deep into the processes that we usually implement without us essentially vetting ourselves, and lacking that objectivity. I'll speak lastly about the challenges and what we try to bear in mind as we go beyond compliance. The first is that, and then you'll see the common thread between what the good rabbi and advocate Zaliso have mentioned, is that the South African historical context can't be ignored. And we're well aware of that. We have a lot of legacy issues. We've got historical resettlements, either from a country or national perspective, or even from the mining industry. We have lack of legislation and some gaps that guide things like cultural heritage and important human rights aspects. And those gaps need to first be dealt with before we can adhere to certain steps in the embedding of human rights. The second challenge is that socioeconomic conditions are such that you can't even start to uncover environmental or direct human rights sentiments without dealing first with the severe income disparities in a country like South Africa. So for example, a mine in the mining industry is often the only form of economic activity in the areas in which we operate. And this therefore situates us within the broader South African challenges of high unemployment, class disparity, and income inequality that have been so well described by the colleagues on the call. The third challenge, as the UNGPs recognizes, that it's very challenging for a company to address all its human rights risks in their entirety. So for this reason, the UNGPs require a process of prioritization where the human rights risks and impacts related to an operation are then identified and assessed according to salience. And an example of this practically how we try to do that within our social way or SHIRA process is a social consequence matrix to try and affect that prioritization and deal really with the critical ones before the rest. And lastly, one of the challenges is getting the message across to all rights holders and actually hearing them all. So a key challenge, it's a very key challenge because we try and ensure that community engagement forum members or other representatives report back to their constituents and receive broad input from communities that they represent to ensure that their rights to access to information are respected. But issues of representation and accompanying that legitimacy and related issues can either be an aid or sometimes, unfortunately, a huge hindrance to direct impact. So a lesson learned from that is that we try to overcome this by ensuring to the best of our ability that direct engagement with rights holders as opposed to gatekeepers or representatives is achieved, and that we need to be rigorous in identifying and quite responsible and implementing measures to monitor and evaluate feedback to communities if they do have representatives to ensure that their rights to access to information are respected as well. In addition to everything I've said, one of the ways in which business can achieve the embedding of human rights beyond compliance is through multi-stakeholder initiatives and partnerships. And this we've definitely tried to achieve, historically, or rather in the more recent past. And these are platforms where we see that companies can work together with civil society, with governments and other stakeholders to identify and address human rights risks and challenges. We ourselves have participated in a platform of this nature through the ICMM in an initiative that is along with the Alternative Mining Indaba, as well as the Minerals Council. And these initiatives we see can help to try, build trust, improve transparency, and then help to drive a positive change in the business world, as opposed to just a one-track or unilateral process. Lastly, I'll say that Anglo American Platinum is intent on putting its skin in the game by being more transparent, to being more collaborative, and embedding human rights systems that are actually fit for purpose, that are rigorous and mature in nature. So we're increasingly reaching out to civil society organizations to assist us in this and be a review mirror, if you like, for our practices at our sites. It's not, admittedly, however, an overnight process, and we understand that there's an ecosystem that has to overcome the past, as my learned colleague has said, and we know that we still have to bridge the gap that's been caused by legacy issues in the South African context. I'll end it there. Thank you, Dr. Acheng.
Thank you very much, Linda. And if I'm hearing you correctly, I think you're saying that you're putting the frameworks in place as Anglo Platinum, but you have certain challenges in the due diligence processes. And then I'm glad that you've made certain recommendations. I know the rabbi will leave in a moment, so I want to go to him. But Linda, I need you to, when I come back to you, to just give us an example of the practical human rights impacts. And I'm not talking about the risks. I'm talking about the impacts. Just give us an example so that we bed this down. We bring this down to very real challenges that you are experiencing as Anglo Platinum. But just think about that. On to the rabbi. Gideon, I know that you live at the end of the hour. And I wanted you to quickly, before you do that, in reflecting on everything that you had said, you'd wanted to talk about the leadership behavior in corporate South Africa and the values of the Constitution. But you also wanted to specifically talk about whistleblowers and the challenges in corporate South Africa. Can I just give you the moment to unpack that before your time is up? You're on mute.
Thank you very much, Dr. A. So perhaps I can touch on both, if I may. That certainly, I think, are related. So the first point about leadership behaviors, I think, relates to the Constitution, and I think is underpinned by a really fundamental point, which has to do with the distinction between what I would call values versus rules, or ethics versus compliance. And in the very compelling address that we just heard from Linda, the emphasis was on going beyond compliance. And of course, those two things are very different. And what I mean by that is that you can have the most sophisticated, the most enlightened documents. You can have the best rules, the best regulations, the best recommendations. But if people don't buy into the underlying values, in other words, if people engage on the level of compliance, but not on the level of ethics, then at best you're going to have a kind of tick box adherence, which is, by definition, shallow. But in the worst case scenario, and perhaps more likely, you're going to have people who are either circumventing or violating. In other words, finding ways to get around those rules or those regulations or those recommendations, or actually just breaking them. And I think that's really significant when it comes to the Constitution, because we have one of the best constitutions in the world, but it's up to us to make sure that its values are embodied in how we behave. And when that doesn't happen, and of course, you know, if you read through the Zondo reports and you know, many other things, you see that discrepancy, and we see the results. And I think that this is something which is particularly relevant for companies. So one of the key projects of our Center for Business Ethics is what we call the Ethics Barometer. It's based on a research tool that was developed at Harvard Business School, which we adapted to address specific South African issues and challenges. And to date, we've had about 35 companies participate, and we've collected data from around 35,000 of their employees. So we have a huge amount of data. And we ask employees to assess their company's ethical performance in terms of a wide range of organizational behaviors. And when it came to the 10 organizational behaviors around which employees had the least positive perceptions, 2 related directly to leadership behaviors. One was leaders living up to the company's values and standards, and another had to do with managers telling the truth to employees. There was a third behavior which was just outside the bottom 10, but only just outside the bottom 10, so there was a low score, and that was leaders taking a strong stand when it comes to right and wrong. So that, I think, was very telling about the embodied values not necessarily reflecting the rules, or there being a culture of compliance, but not necessarily of ethics. And that was also backed up by the qualitative data. We got comments, verbatim comments from thousands of employees, and we did a content analysis of those comments, and we found that 20% of the comments referred to the abuse of power. Another 10% related to leaders being, or managers being, disrespectful of employees. So the first point I wanted to mention was, when it comes to constitutionalism, when it comes to the values in our constitution, they, like in any document, however lofty, have to be embodied in how we behave. And I think that for corporate leaders, it's very important to engage in a process of self-reflection and to see whether their behaviors indeed reflect the espoused values, the values espoused in the Constitution, and the values that may well be espoused in company codes of ethics, of so on and so on. Our colleagues at Harvard Business School, the ones with whom we collaborated to establish the Ethics Barometer, speak about the altitude effect. And basically what the altitude effect implies is that the higher up you go in an organization, the more disconnected you are likely to be, and the more rose-tinted a view you are likely to form. And so it's very important to counter that altitude effect and to engage in this process of self-reflection, and to ensure that there is, as much as possible, congruence or alignment between values and behaviors, so between rules and values. So that's the first point I wanted to make. The second, if I may briefly address, has to do with whistleblowing. Whistleblowing, as we all know, is absolutely essential if we are going to win this struggle against corruption and state capture. The lawyer Michael Katz talks about the need to cultivate a culture of dissent. Culture of dissent, he says, is the most effective bulwark against ethical failure. And I think that's true both within organizations and in broader society. Now, in our research with the Ethics Barometer, we found that there are serious problems when it comes to developing this culture of dissent. So I can just illustrate it with some data. We asked our survey respondents whether they had witnessed 18 different types of misconduct over the past 24 months. And these types of misconduct included tolerating bullying and intimidation, discrimination on the grounds of race or gender, the stealing and misuse of company property, bending rules to meet targets, sexual harassment, whole range of different types of misconduct. And we found that 45% of respondents said that they had seen at least one of those types of misconduct. But when we asked those 45% whether they had reported the misconduct that they'd seen, and only 30% said that they had done so. So then we went to that 30% and we said, well, why? Oh, sorry, we went to the 70% who did not report the misconduct that they saw. And we asked them why they didn't report. And the two most common reasons given were fear of victimization, that was 43%, and the company won't take action, 33%. So if you add that together, 77% didn't report the misconduct. Of those that didn't report, 77% didn't do so either because of fear of victimization or because they felt their company wouldn't take action. And what those two reasons clearly have in common is a lack of trust, is a lack of psychological or institutional safety. And it's very important, I would suggest, for organizations to promote that safety and to promote a culture of dissent so that people feel free and confident to challenge misconduct. We subsequently did research into the experiences of whistleblowers. We interviewed 27 whistleblowers and people who had supported whistleblowers, including some of the most prominent whistleblowers in the country, and published a white paper, which anyone who's interested in, we'd be very happy to share with. And our findings were shocking. The price that whistleblowers pay, whether physically, financially, psychologically, emotionally, is absolutely horrendous. And many of them are treated as pariahs. There's this kind of bizarre paradox where you have people who will, on the one hand, acknowledge, even celebrate whistleblowers, but they won't give them a job because they're seen as being troublemakers. And what I would suggest, and I'll close with this, is that when the Constitution in the preamble says that we must honor those who suffered for justice and freedom in our land, the contemporary manifestation of that may well be whistleblowers. They are people who indeed have suffered and are suffering for justice and freedom in our land. And so what I would suggest we need to do, in line with the values of the preamble, is to honor those people, to celebrate those people, and to do it genuinely, to do it not only through our words, but where appropriate, through giving them opportunities as well. So let me stop there, but thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to participate in this important discussion, and I do apologize for having to leave early. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Gideon. We appreciate your time. You are very, very clear. We need to protect whistleblowers. We need to promote safety and a culture of dissent. I don't think I need to add anything there, but thank you very much for joining us. I'm now going to come back to the advocate and at the same time begin to read from the Q&A. And Andre, I had seen Andre Oberholzer from SAPI put in a few comments earlier after you made your remarks. So I'm going to give you the right to listen and to help to take the discussion forward based on this. So Andre says that, and this is based on what you talked about, companies should just not extract, and it should be about nation building. So he said, I'm sorry, but which companies come here to extract and then take away? What about South Africa-based multinationals and other JSE-listed companies? that are homegrown and have always been here building the country. Let's not fall into generalizations. Andre goes on to say, and this is in terms of your call to support political parties, that most companies now have global policies that prevent them from supporting political parties. This requirement was driven by civil society. Are we now going to debate to reverse that? And then an anonymous attendee, and anonymous, I'd recommend that you just write your name. This is a safe space. Says that economic growth and transformation also becomes difficult when we take into account that we are operating in a low growth environment. A social compact that focuses on the key inhibitors is needed. I think a really, really important point as well, because we operate in a context that is up and down. We make 2 steps forward and 1 back, and that affects a range of issues. Anonymous goes ahead to say we also need to differentiate between constitutional ideals and economic system, because the power of rights get unstuck when we meet the rights of power in the business world. It's not very clear to me, the last bit, but advocate, before we get engaged, and we are going to open the floor further, please continue to give us your reflections. You can reflect on these points that are on the Q&A as well.
Thank you. And thanks again for the opportunity. Let me start. I began my remarks up saying that it's a mixed bag. So I did not say all businesses are bad, nor did I say all of them are good. But we live in a country where we have high levels of poverty, unemployment, and inequalities. And certainly we cannot exclude or excuse the role of businesses in the current dispensation. Many of them are responsible for massive human rights violations in our country that we cannot run away from. At the same time, many are also helping a lot, whether it's multinationals or homegrown. So we can't make a clear distinction between multinationals and homegrown and say, well, those from outside are bad and those from within are good. It's not work. It's not scientific at all. And therefore, you know, we do need to acknowledge this. And I think the TRC report spells out very clear what was the role of corporates in our country as far as the past injustices are concerned. Therefore, companies have a moral responsibility to basically, as Gideon was saying, to address that. But also, we must be very clear that human rights are crucial for sustainability of businesses. I think people are beginning to realize that you cannot run a company in a sustainable manner if you undermine human rights. And therefore, there is a need to shift from that mentality of the past, where the role of business was simply just to make money and enhance the shareholder value without much regard as to what happens. Let us look at Gauteng now. Johannesburg, we have lots of acid mine challenges in our country due to mining issues. Mpumalanga, massive pollution of the air due to businesses. At the same time, of course, there have been other benefits. So that's my response on that one. Secondly, on the issue of political party funding, all over the world, there is no country in the world where, well, I mean, most countries, let me say Western countries, we all know what happens when it comes to elections. Business plays a major role in funding businesses. Hence, we talk of corporate political spending. Most businesses do that. All I was simply saying is that we need to regulate that, because if it's unregulated, it does lead to other things. We've heard of the fines that Glencore has to pay in the US and UK due to corruption. So that's why in our country we have laws which basically requires political parties to disclose their political funding. So nobody's saying that companies should not fund. It's how it should be done. And I was saying, when you look at the Companies Act, there's still a need to reform the laws so that at least when companies fund political parties, there is more transparency and more accountability. At this point in time, you don't have much accountability as to how boards and management decides to use the value of companies to fund political parties. Where is accountability? So there's still a need for much improvement in that regard. Now, on the issue of economic growth, definitely, I mean, as Mandela was saying, poverty and material inequality are enemies of lasting peace and stability. The reason why a lot of business are disappearing from countries which are unstable is because you cannot do business properly without stability and peace. And that's why we're saying it's also important then businesses to ensure that the environment in which they work in is peaceful and stable. And that means you also have to contribute towards human rights and democracy and good governance. Now, I want to be very controversial to say, you know, if I was to lock all business in South Africa, that they stay here, they don't even go out and take a cent out, I can assure you, this will be a different country because this is your home now. You have no options to run away and therefore you invest. Let us look at how much of the monies go out from our country as foreign investment flow. And we know our economy has been based on that, largely on people coming from outside to invest in our country and taking the money out. So this is not your home, so you don't have to invest as much as you can. But if this was your home, definitely we'll be talking about a different issues here. So all I'm just saying is that, you know, we need to accept that businesses are part of us and they have to play that role. Just like we expect citizens to play that role, the mentality has to change. So sorry for acting as if I don't care about homegrown companies. I do care about them as well. It's a mixed bag. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Advocate, for your response. I would encourage that we keep putting questions in the Q&A. This is a business discussion and we only have Lindo on the platform from business. So please feel free to give your examples, to write down your experiences, especially as companies. So the discussion is helpful and we can generate the required knowledge. But before I come back to the chat, Lindo, I did ask you a question before I went to the rabbi around giving us, let us bring this to be more practical. What are the human rights impacts, even if you prioritize, that you've experienced at Anglo Platinum?
Thanks, Dr. Cheng, and thanks for the call for support for colleagues online as well. But yeah, I think the best way to describe it is, you know, essentially what we've noticed are salient human rights risks or impacts rather, and I'll put them in buckets. The first being labor rights. So that's obviously potential abuse of our direct employees internally, as well as contractor employees, and that presents itself in different you know, manners: sexual harassment, GBV as a whole, in contractors feeling discriminated against, contractors' working hours. So a lot of things that we wouldn't directly have control over, but that we have to ensure and are responsible to ensure that our contractors have an understanding of how an Anglo would operate. And obviously then we implement or try and enforce those protocols along with our contractors as well. The second bucket would be security. So a huge potential for degrading treatment, injury, death of employees and community members within a security context. So anything that essentially would be highlighted in the VPSHR as you know, activity that's frowned upon. And that obviously we have our own protocols to try and protect against that. The third, especially security, you know, in light of protests, and we know we're quite a protest heavy country. So, you know, we're really aware of that and try to build in the right protocols. The third bucket would be community impact. So potential for long-term impact, disruption of community lives and livelihoods, especially with the very normal practice of resettlements in the mining context. So well aware of that, as well as traditions. The right to, so cultural heritage, definitely more prevalent as we try and be more focused on it in a contemporary South Africa. Whereas in the past, with the lack of legislation and the gaps there, it was really overridden as a highlighted human right. So that's really a large impact that we're seeing. The fourth bucket would be supply chain. Again, trying to build in the correct protocols along our value chain so that any affiliated companies behave in the same way that Anglo purports or tries to behave. So there's potential for complicity in third party harm, and that ranges, you know, from anything from a corruption perspective, economic activity that's frowned upon, to you know, behavior within our communities and enabling certain social injustices as well. So we really try and enforce that. And the last bucket would be safety, health, and environment from a SHE perspective. So potential for damage to health from dust, blasting, and really just environmental impact as well. And that would really be the buckets of the types of impacts that we come across from a saliency perspective.
Thank you very much, Linda. That really puts things in perspective. You may know that we are currently running a human rights accelerator, and these issues come up. So it's always important for us to understand the risks that companies face, but also the impacts that companies bear in the communities where they operate. I'll go back into the questions. I see Paul is saying that Paul Capella, Synergy, over the past 10 years, South Africa has become a high-risk destination for investors who are subject to various pieces of international legislation. Reliance on the Constitution and the Bill of Rights is unfortunately not enabling human rights to be respected. What should the business response be? I will throw that to both of you and to anyone in the audience who would like to respond to that. Someone is asking about the role of NEDLAC in furthering business and human rights in South Africa at this stage. So 2 questions. I'm still encouraging business in the room to please come to the table in terms of your experiences. But let me give it back to the advocate. Would you like to reflect on what Paul is asking?
Yes, you know, the realization of human rights require resources. So it requires that we grow our economy, and without growing that economy, we're in trouble. And this is where then business becomes a very important partner, because business basically is quite fundamental in growing the economy, in providing resources and creating jobs and stuff like that. And that's why we're saying that, you know, we will actually do a lot more as far as human rights and democracy are concerned if business actually saw itself as a crucial partner in supporting democracy, in looking at all the values which we have mentioned here: accountability, human dignity. That is really the bulk of the role of business. And the reality is that increasingly business entities are becoming much more powerful than states. And therefore it means going forward, future rights is going to depend more and more on the conduct of business. That's why then there's this push that, you know, we need to make business to appreciate that at the end of the day, they will be the primary drivers of human rights. Look at all over the world, US, Japan, UK, business has been at the forefront in building those countries and building those nations. And in our country, unfortunately, due to the way we've been doing business in the past, it was never really the case because it was not our home. Let us make our country viable. So if we were to improve issues of democracy and human rights, there will be less violence, there will be less crime, and therefore we'll create a very conducive environment for people to do business. So we're actually shooting ourselves in the foot as government, as South Africans, if we don't uphold human rights and democracy, because then we don't create a conducive environment to attract investments, to attract people into business, and therefore we grow the economy. At this point in time, economy is losing money. People are losing jobs. Eskom is a mess. Potholes are all over the show. And of course, this basically threatens democracy and human rights in the future of our country. Thanks.
Thank you. Linda, would you like to reflect on the same from Paul?
Yes, thanks. I think Paul asks a critical question because he's addressing the gaps again from a legislative perspective of implementing legislation that's maybe not as advanced as global countries, modern slavery legislation and things that actually help practicalize and implement those laws and regulations. And what we're seeing is a blurring of lines between John Ruggie's very perfect 3 pillars of business and human rights, where business finds itself in a position where it has to go beyond just the respect for human rights, but really protection as well. And I think it's a call and a huge responsibility for business to respond in that way. Business has to chart the path, as Advocate Sidiso was saying. Business is responsible even for bringing in, and especially from a multinational company perspective, applying higher standards to what is required of us from a national perspective. So we can't operate without implementing the corporate sustainability due diligence protocols and things that are implemented in the EU, for instance, or proposed at an EU level, because we do have a footprint in some of those countries, and we'd like to see and reflect the same behavior in the country. We can't suddenly package that in a different geographic footprint, and then in South Africa act and be, act or operate in a different manner. So it's really a responsibility to be holistic and be respectful and protect human rights holistically. But it's also a delicate balance between the implementing some of those and charting the path and really being heroes in that sense, as Advocate Sidiso was saying, and overriding government. The delicate balance is in ensuring that business is also a bit more receptive to collaborative processes, to actually listen to rights holders, to be privy or rather receptive to processes that allow responses and input from actual rights holders, and not override that by really just trying to be at the forefront of trying to be responsible or implement protocols that allow respect for human rights. So it's actually being attentive, listening, collaborative, collaborating, as I said, with civil society and other types and pockets of the country or the nation that could actually lend to the conversation. So I like the comment made by Anonymous, who spoke of a social compact, and that's an important process, social compacting with rights holders, with other stakeholders, but making sure that it's not in a power imbalanced way.
Thank you very much, Linda. Advocate, I don't think you responded to NEDLAC, but we can pack it, it's okay. Chloe, I want to read Chloe, it's a very long one, but the question at the bottom, this is about, I feel that we know what we need to do. I think I agree, but I think the discussion, especially from Linda, has brought to the fore some complexities, but broadly, we know what we need to do. Chloe says, I'm more concerned with how we are actualizing the needs of regulations and policies, because I find that a lot of the policies we have, our governance mechanisms, are not actually followed or implemented by those same mechanisms. Large-scale international businesses are given all sorts of financial breaks and development prioritization that directly go against national and local policies. Chloe goes ahead to give the example of Amazon headquarters development in Cape Town Observatory. So the legal system has failed this process of constitutional honoring and has prioritized business profits over human rights. So how can we ensure international and local businesses actually partner in these values, and that our governance mechanisms seem to not be prioritized? Advocate, before you respond to this, in the human rights discussions with business, the one thing that often comes up is how the failure of government to protect rights, because government has an obligation to protect rights according to the Ruggie framework that we use. Due to the failure of government to protect rights, some businesses often say that can somehow undermine the business responsibilities in respecting and advancing rights. So I want you to reflect on both and give us your views as you respond to what Chloe is saying, which somehow also implies that for very large multinationals, government is undermining its own regulation or its own laws to give them flexibility to operate.
Thanks. Just a flashback to the NADLEC issue. I was just going to say it's like a three-legged African pot. Business, government, and unions or civil society. And if one leg is short, the pot is not stable. Of course, as to how successful NADLEC has become, that's a debate, but one hopes that at least the idea was that, you know, it's basically a three-legged pot which can actually work for the interest of the country. But there might be challenges there, but I think the intention is still there that, you know, it is a partnership between business, government, civil society to ensure that, you know, we advance our country and we advance professionalism. Now, on the issue of regulation, there has been a concern. Of course, some people talk about over-regulation, that it takes long for business in South Africa to get started because of the red tape in government. I guess one cannot, ignore that argument. But on the other hand, where at least I'm coming from and much more familiar, some of us have been concerned about the weaknesses of government to ensure that business does comply with human rights standards. I'll give you a few examples. If we talk about issues of inequalities and discrimination, which is also available in the Constitution, we have an act here called the Promotion of Equality and Prevention of Unfair Discrimination Act. A first-class act, basically, which was designed to address issues of inequality. We know, for example, the composition at board levels in JSC in terms of gender and race is still a problem 30 years later. Inequalities are still there. But then you find that, you know, the implementation of these laws, whether it's Equality Act or Employment Equity Act, it's not really happening that well. And a lot of businesses basically have found ways of avoiding or taking advantage of the failure of government to basically enforce some of these laws which were well intended. Of course, if you don't like them, you can always amend them. The second issue is my own institution, the South African Human Rights Commission, which has a mandate to monitor human rights in both public and private spheres. Unfortunately, for a number of reasons, we have done very little to regulate, to ensure that business also complies with human rights and also encourage business to be much more forefront as far as the promotion and advancement of human rights. So yes, you can say it's a double-edged sword, depending on which side of the bread you are. But certainly, yes, we need to ensure that we create a conducive environment through regulation to ensure that business does operate much more in a conducive manner. At the same time, we need to make sure that we also have good regulations as well, to ensure that those rogues in the business world are dealt with. And therefore, we encourage those who are doing well, because you see, it's another thing in our country that, you know, with the high levels of corruption, as a business person, start wondering, you know, should I also join the bad guys in order to survive or not? So we need to be very careful about these issues where, you know, most companies cannot operate without being shaken down or 10% there and there. It undermines our economy, it undermines everything else. So as I'm saying, regulation can be good or bad. Unfortunately, in our country with high levels of corruption, we tend to ignore the good rules and then only focus on the bad rules. Thanks.
Thank you. Lindo, any comments before I go to, I want us to wind down and end at in another 5 minutes. I wanted to take just one more. And Chloe, I'm not sure you are satisfied. It was a very specific example from Amazon, but I want to go back to Anonymous, who has refused to put their name. I'm not sure that it's true that business is not playing a role in the realization of rights in South Africa. Business for South Africa was a crucial partner in the government response to COVID-19. I think it's the attitudes of this government towards white business that are core risk to the polity. Honest and genuine social dialogue is required. That means that in all conversation at all times, there's a conversation that sits at what is actually best for the country. So there's a call there for more social dialogue. I know very many business organizations have been calling for the advancement of a social compact. Maybe we need a conversation to say, why is everyone calling for this and nothing is happening? What is it that we need to do? How do we convene and you know, agree on a common agenda and then move forward from there through a social dialogue? But Anonymous, before I even give the panel the opportunity to respond, I think someone earlier, and I think it's the advocate who said, it's not just about respecting business. That is the fundamental, the primary role of business. But business also have a big role to promote or to advance human rights. So we do both. For us, from the UNGPs, from the guiding principles, it is paramount that business should do whatever it takes to cause no harm. So we say, put people in the middle. It's risk to people, not risk to the company. If you solve risk to people and prevent that, you won't have any risk to the company, or it will be very, very minimal. So Anonymous, I'm just saying there's different elements to this debate. And so the business for South Africa, or the business response to COVID, the way we saw business pull together, that was promoting, that was advancing human rights during that pandemic, right? It doesn't absolve business from respecting human rights. But Linda, over to you on your reflections before we come to the final remarks. Yes.
Thanks. On the social compacting or dialogue process, I think one of the challenges that business would face, even if they are benevolent companies, you know, that really want to embark on the process of, as I say, being collaborative, listening, is that we can't ignore the trust deficit that exists, you know, between citizens and business. It's a reality, more so with the type of history that we have in the country. So the question is, who convenes? Who sets the structure up? Who, you know, from an independent perspective, without an interest in that conversation that's profit-driven or whatever it may be seen to be, who's the driver of that? And I think that's one of the challenges in setting up a structure of that manner. We've tried in different ways to do so, but again, as I say, you cannot ignore what some would say the elephant in the room, that it's still a company that is purporting to be benevolent and awesome and great, and people really still struggle to overcome that, more so from a civil society perspective. It's the reality. And going back to just Chloe's question very quickly on I would say it's more of also a lack of clarity from a regulatory perspective. What you have in other countries, and I think Kenya is the only country on our continent who's managed to come up with an effective and implement a national action plan on business and human rights. We have legislation, we have different pockets that say the right things, as Advocate Sidiso has said, of legislation that's quite concrete and helpful, but maybe the bypassing is coming from one succinct you know, avenue or something that's tangible, that's, you know, really streamlines the imperatives, and maybe that's where the gap is from a regulatory perspective as well. So those would be my reflections on those two questions.
Thank you very much. We coming closer to the end now, and as you two prepare your final remarks, I just wanted to say that it's been a lot of information and recommendations that have come through this morning. If we all remember where we came from, the question was 26 years on, how far have we come when it comes to the Constitution and the fulfillment of the Bill of Rights? and wearing the lens of business, looking at the business role. How far have we come? It's clear to me that this conversation also needs to happen with government, because we're getting questions around regulation, around the government role in protecting rights. So it would be a better rounded conversation if we had a government in the room, a point that we will take. But having said that, I think there are very clear recommendations that have come through. I won't recap all of them, but we will write out a brief and share with everyone who attended this morning. And so, Advocate, just your final, in a few seconds, your final remarks, and then we'll close at 12:35 after Linda.
Yes. Thanks. I mean, I just want to say that, at this point in time, our democracy is under threat. Issues of economic and social justice need to be attended to. However, what is very important is that the future depends on how we cooperate together as business, government, and citizens. And I think we need to understand that we need each other. And therefore, we need to ensure that we are all committed to democracy and human rights in our various roles. Because it is very clear, everyone has a right to pursue business and a trade. So business have a right, personal right to operate. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Advocate. Linda.
Thanks, Dr. Cheng. I think my reflection would be that really business is becoming more aware of its responsibility, whether it's from a compliance perspective still and tick box exercising, or really what we're trying to achieve, which is a value-based approach. But there's definitely, an understanding of the responsibility that lies in corporate hands. It's also important for companies to operationalize their policies in order to ensure that, again, there's more of a value-based approach. And I think that's where the key lies. Culture is very important because that is what will pull us away from a compliance-based, rules-based, and tick box exercising in terms of how we operationalize policy and human rights and the embedding of it. So corporate culture, and if that is focused on as a foundation, absolutely imperative. And regulation is important. It really is. And I think corporates are aware of that. But what is a fear is over certification, over regulation that then moves away from being able to make a positive impact. So those would be my last remarks. Thanks so much.
Thank you both very much. Let me take this opportunity to also thank the participants and all those who've listened through the 1.5+ hours and all those who have contributed. I want to say again that this platform is open. It's open for strategic business conversations, and civil society can contribute to this platform. Government can appear on this platform. It's really our open platform for conversations, for dialogues on our critical development issues. On that note, I will hand over back to Rethabile, who may have a few closing remarks or way forward before we then close. So thank you very much for being here today. Rethabile.
Thank you so much. With that said, I would like from my side just to say thank you, of course, to the participants and our panelists, and also to the team. The team, you may not know, but putting this together is such teamwork. And just to name a few people who have made this happen, Dr. Busiso Moyo for thinking about who to invite, the writing behind the scenes, and of course, Sifiso Nkosi, who's always our person doing all the social media things, making everything happen from our side. So thank you so much, team. And also to say our next Compact Dialogue will be in May. You get all the details about it in way ahead of time, but our focus then will be on the VNR, the Voluntary National Review of the SDGs. How far has South Africa come? How far has the business come with regards to the SDGs? But we'll unpack all of this in our next communication. And thank you so much, everybody. Thank you for coming today. Bye.
Thank you, and have a good day. Bye now.